Hello everyone. In this video we're going to talk about a really nice tool in our studio called Rmarkdown and nidar that allows us to not just write code that we run and execute and create plots with, but integrate writing a report with writing and running our code and generating plots right in that report. So we can sort of write a programmatic document called an Rmarkdown document, and then when we compile or knit that document, we end up with an HTML file or a PDF or a Word document that combines both words and section headers, etc., with code and R output. And when you knit it, it actually executes all of the R code that you have run in sequence, much as if you've written it in a script. So without further ado, we are going to begin engaging with that. So as with everything, I have created a folder that I'm going to use for this example. So the folder for me is in Documents, PHI 512, Rmarkdown example. And this is going to serve the function of my working directory for this Rmarkdown document. We'll see working directories work a little bit differently with Rmarkdown. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Applications and open RStudio. Great. RStudio will slowly but surely open. Oops. And here I'm going to open it, and I have no scripts open, no Rmarkdown documents open. So I'm going to create a new Rmarkdown document for this example. File, new file, not RScript now, Rmarkdown. So in here it asks me for a title. I can name it whatever I want. I'm going to name it example. And then it asks me what sort of output I want to generate. I can generate an HTML document. I can generate a PDF document, though sometimes it requires that a couple of other things are installed on your computer. So if you don't have them installed, it might give you a little bit of trouble when you try to compile this. Or I could compile an MS Word document. And I need Microsoft Word on my computer to do this. But again, this is a nice way to compile a Word document that has both text as well as plots and tables and such, and executes our code. We're going to start with an HTML document for now, though. So I click HTML, I click OK, and it gives me this sort of template here with a bunch of different things in it. We see some sort of weird stuff at the beginning, something that maybe looks sort of like our code here. There's a $sign, looks like maybe a function involved, but not a function we're familiar with. And then some other words, right? And it's like words combined with maybe chunks that look like they have our code in them. Excellent. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to save this in that folder we had created. So for me, that folder was in Documents, PHI 512, Rmarkdown example, and I'm going to call this my example. So I save it, and we see if we go in there, Documents, PHI 512, Rmarkdown example, there's now a file called myexample.rmd, and .rmd means it's an Rmarkdown file. So the first thing we're going to do is, again, this is sort of a template with an example template, and if I click knit, it will run through all of the code and generate this into an HTML document for me. So this is the output from that. We can see it has this big example at the front. That's because I said title is example. Then we can ignore this line for now. The next thing we have is these two hashtags and then Rmarkdown. And if we go back to that document, we see what the first section header is called Rmarkdown. Okay, so two hashtags indicates this is a section header. Then we have some text in here. This is an Rmarkdown document. Markdown is a simple formatting syntax for authoring HTML, etc., which we see that's all the text that we have in here. Great. Then here, right after it says you can embed an R chunk, code chunk like this, it has something that looks like R code and R output. So let's go back to the Rmarkdown document. And we see right after you can embed an R code chunk like this, we have this section where Rmarkdown, and we'll discuss more detail on this in a minute, indicates that it would like to run some R code. So these chunks that look like this are chunks of R code, and inside it has some R commands that it then executes. Cars is a data set that lives sort of in the base R installation. And summary cars takes this cars data set, again, cars is a data set that lives there, and just outputs a summary of that data set. So we can see if we go back here in the HTML document that was generated, this line summary of cars is run, and this is the output. Great, so these lines, again, created all of this. The next line is this including plots line, which is, again, a new section title that's indicated by those pound signs or hashtags. So we have including plots, a little bit more text. Great, and then another R command, this time plotting the pressure data set, which also, again, lives in base R. And so, again, we then have this plot of that data set. And they talk about when we write a little chunk of R code, we can tell the document when it compiles, when it knits itself together, whether we want to include the chunk of R code as well as the output, like here. Here we have the R command as well as the output, or if we just want, if we just want the output, like in this lower one. So anyhow, big picture, when you open this R Markdown document, it always comes sort of standard with this template that we will then delete and rewrite for ourselves from scratch. And this template, again, combines text as well as R code. So one last piece, if we now go to the folder where I compiled this from, where I click knit, when I say compile, I mean knit, took that R Markdown document and turned it into an HTML document, I now have this .html file, and that is exactly this file. If we double click it, it will open in a web browser. Oops. And you can see I was looking at chess there. It opens in a web browser, and it's exactly what we saw before. So this, I say it created an HTML document. You know, we can think of this alternatively as it sort of created a little website on our computer that we can peek at, right? And so you can make little write-ups in the form of HTML documents. Or again, we could have it knit to a PDF or to a Microsoft Word document. Excellent. So I want to engage with R code, but I don't want to engage with this R code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete almost everything that's in here, and then I'm going to do a little bit of analysis of the nhanes data. Okay, so how do we do that? So the first thing we do, we want to leave these lines, and we also want to leave this first little chunk of R code in there. That is something that's sort of specific and needed by our Markdown or knitr. So we're going to delete all the rest of this. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to make the first section title. So maybe this is my first section in all caps. I don't know why I'm saying that. Hi everyone, here is my first section. And if I were to first save this and then click knit, it will overwrite the previous HTML document, and it will give me a document with just that section title. We have example at the beginning because that's the title of the document. Oops. And then we have that first section title, and then we have that text. And here there's actually no R at all that I have run except that first little chunk that we're not going to worry about. Right? But we see that this is a way to sort of build an HTML document at the very least. We'll include our first R snippet. And so to include a snippet of R, you do 3 single quotes. And on the Mac, these quotes are the button to the left of the 1 key. I'm not totally sure where they are on the PC. You then have an open brace, an R. You would type your code in here, say 1 + 1, and then 3 more of the same single quotes. So if we ran this now, if we recompiled this, what would we get? We would get that same text, then we would have a little snippet of our code that said 1 + 1, and then we would have an output which would say 2. So I will save, I will click knit. Exactly, so we have the same thing as before, plus this little code that says 1 + 1, and now this output that says 2. Excellent. So we can do more interesting things, like we could, for example, read in the nhanes data and then write some summaries in here. So to read in the nhanes data, we have to set our working directory. The thing that's nice about our Markdown documents is that by default, they set the working directory to be exactly where the directory that you have saved the RMD file you are working with. So here, I save this RMD file, my_example.rmd, in this folder called rmarkdown-example. Also in that folder, I have nhanes.csv. So here, I could, for example, in this R chunk, say dat assign read.csv nhanes.csv. Oops, forgot my quotes. Okay, and then I could say dim dat. So when I run this, two things will happen. It will read in the data, store it in that object dat, and then output its dimension. So let's save it, and then let's knit it. Excellent. We see, okay, here's my chunk of code. It reads in the data set, which is in that directory that it's in. So it doesn't give me a problem with an issue with working directories. And then it outputs the dimension of that data set, which, as we know from our labs, has 500 observations and 15 variables. Great. So we could also, for example, output a box plot, right, for dat $age, for the age column of dat. Here we see a box plot for ages in the nhanes dataset, right? We can add in a little bit of text, and then we could add in another R chunk and write box plot dat age. And now if we click knit, right, we should now have two chunks of code. Right? First we have this part that reads in the data and outputs the dimension. Then we have this next part that gives me a box plot for age. Excellent. Now, going back here for a second, in a write-up, I might not want to include the code that reads in the data. You probably don't need to see that, right? If you're writing this for a collaborator, your collaborator maybe doesn't need to see that. The collaborator just wants to see the box plot. And maybe they don't even need to see the code for the box plot. So if that were the case, we can add, in this place where we have open bracket R, close bracket, we can add additional inputs. And these are not inputs to R, right? The R code is all in here. These are inputs to our Markdown that tell us when you generate the document, formatted in certain ways. So for example, we can say echo equals false. And if you do this, what it will do is it will not put the R code in your compiled document. It will just put the output of the R code in your document. So where we used to have that R code, now we just have the output, just what we get from the dim command. And probably we don't even really want to see this dim command anymore, right? That was interesting before, but not any longer. And so we might want to put that also in this chunk. Again, note I put a comma between R and this next input, which says echo equals false. And so we could say, rather than this goofy thing, we could say, here in this write-up, we will engage with a subset of the nhanes dataset. And we could call this section intro. So in this write-up, we will engage with a subset of the nhanes dataset. Then we do some R stuff that is going to be hidden once we generate the document. Here we see a box plot for ages in our nhanes subset, right? And then again, we will just see the output of that final code, right? And that first line, we don't see any output. Just to go back for a second, we're not going to see any output on our write-up of this because this creates an object called dat, but there's no output generally to the console here, right? Whereas down here, there is an output from this, which is a box plot, right? So again, if we go back out here, we see we have intro, we have a little bit of text. In here, we read in the data, but it doesn't output anything. Now we have this discussion about the box plot we're about to see, and then we have this box plot. And maybe, again, we want to add in a title to this box plot. Main equals ages of people in nhanes dataset, or subset, maybe we could call it. We can re-knit this. Excellent. And then what do we see? We now see we have a new title. All right, so this is really cool, and we could form our whole write-up for any of our assignments using this, right? That would be one way to again combine text and output from R. One thing that might be a problem here is, again, I remember that there was a column name called age in this data set, but what if we don't remember the names of the objects in this data set, right? As you'll note, this doesn't look like our usual interactive R window. We have the console on the bottom, I suppose, but maybe we would like to try to interactively run code directly from this Rmarkdown document. And it turns out we can still do that. For example, we can click on this line and we can click run. Run selected lines. It can also run these chunks of code. And in fact, it actually ran this line above, which is not really a problem, but it now ran this line in our console, right? We could now go down here and we could click run, or we could press Control Enter to run one line of code. And now it ran this box plot code. And it does something really neat here, which is when you just run lines in your Rmarkdown document below the chunk of code, right? This is often referred to as a code chunk. You can directly see the output. So the output is right here of that box plot. And we can remove that if we get tired of seeing it. So for example, if we had some text, now we are finished. Let's just knit this really quickly to see what our new HTML document looks like. Oops. One thing, if we look at this HTML document, oops, we didn't have a new line between our plot and now we are finished. So generally you would add one more line in here. So let's try this again. Great, so we have our box plot. It says now we are finished. We're pretty happy with ourselves. Now, if, again, we wanted to look at the box plot without knitting everything, we could just run this line of code. Again, we could click run current chunk, and it would just run everything in here. It output the box plot in here, and it just, again, it added a little bit of space in here to our Markdown document. So where line 22 is initially right below line 21, now we have this box plot that we look at, and line 22 and line 23 are down here. And if we get tired of looking at this box plot again, we just click the X, oops, and it disappears. So the Rmarkdown documents are nice. You can run each of these chunks of code if you want to, right, on their own like you would for an R script. Or at the end, you can try to knit the whole thing together and create a nice HTML document or a Word document. One word of warning, if you have an error, so let's imagine down here before now we are finished. Next, we will output the names of the variables in our data set. So let's imagine I wanted to have an R chunk that would output the names of the variables in the data set. And again, let's imagine I don't want to look at the code. I just want the value. So we remember names, that this line should do that. Names.dat should output the names of the variables in the data set. Let's imagine I forgot the last parenthesis. Okay, so there's an error in this line. So first thing to note, there is this X, which is indicating, hey, I think there's an error. And sometimes we'll have that and sometimes we won't. Let's imagine we tried to run this. We click knit now with that error. It goes through and it says, uh-oh, this doesn't work. And it gives me an error message that is very hard to read. And here it says it's on line 25, so that's useful. Sometimes it won't give the right line, and it will be very hard to figure out where it is. And that's one downside of just trying to click knit and getting this to work. That again, if you have an error in your code, it's not like with a script where you obviously run it line by line and detect it. Here, again, we could run this line by line. We could say, okay, first run this chunk, run current chunk. Oops, go to the console. Okay, that worked. We could then say, okay, now run this chunk, run current chunk. Okay, now that worked. And then we could go down here. Okay, run current chunk. Oh, now it's broken. So that would be one way to identify where the error is. But if we just try to do that with knit, it's not going to work very well. So I'm going to close that parenthesis. I'm going to fix this. I'm going to click knit, and let's see what we get. Great, we now have this additional nice little chunk of code. And there are ways, this plot's like way too big and kind of ugly. There are ways to make that plot smaller, to change various pieces of the formatting. Again, I'm not going to go into detail for them now. I think they're not so important, but this idea of combining text and code together to knit together into one document, I think is very, very powerful. And again, at the end of the day, we close all this out. If we look in that folder, we have that HTML file that we can open, and it will open all of that right in our web browser for us. Right? And so we could just look at it there. It is this HTML document for us to engage with at the end of the day. So let's do one more thing. I set this up to create an HTML document. You instead could set this up to create a PDF document or a Word document. So let's try to do that. Let's try to make another Rmarkdown document that will compile, and instead of giving us an HTML document, let's try to get it to give us, say, a Word document. So again, we go File, New File, Rmarkdown. We can make the title whatever we want. I'll say MS Word example. I guess I can put spaces in here. I will click Word, and I have Microsoft Word installed on my computer. Click OK, and now it gives me a new document. And actually, if you notice, the only difference between the previous document and the new document is at the very top of this, rather than HTML document, it says Word document. So in fact, if we wanted to just take our previous example, and maybe we should do this, and modify it to be a Word document instead, we would just replace HTML document with Word document. We would save that, and then we would click knit. It would go through, it would do all of this. It's opening Microsoft Word on my computer. We're slowly getting there, and here we go. It has now generated a Microsoft Word document for me, right, where I have these various objects in it. I can't really edit it in here because it's read-only, but if I close this and I go here, I see that I have my example.docx that I can now open, and it will open in Microsoft Word, and then I can edit it here if I so desire. Generally, it would not be good form to edit it here if there were things that I wanted to change. If there were things that I wanted to change, what I should really do is change those things on my Rmarkdown document, modify those, and then re-knit it and get a new Word document. And that way, if the data set changes or if I want to add new things, I don't have to redo those changes in formatting in Microsoft Word each time. I just change them here once. So, and in fact, let's see, I'm forgetting how we would do this if we wanted a PDF document, but let's try changing output to PDF document. Hopefully this works and I don't look foolish. So if I click knit, yep, I think this is the final thing to change. And here, oops, so somehow the formatting got a little bit messed up. And I think maybe that's because I needed a couple of spaces. Let's try this now with the new spaces. Yep, here we go. So now we see we can just as easily also compile to a PDF document. And again, the PDF, the HTML, and the Word all look a little bit different because our studio is doing a lot of work under the hood to create these. But it's a nice way to be able to, again, combine all these things without copying and pasting and cutting and, doing lots of things that are error prone that you might have to modify every time you change things. And again, if we go here into this folder, we now have my example.pdf that again, I can just open and it opens in like Adobe Acrobat. Excellent. So you're not going to be required to engage with Rmarkdown at all in this course, but it can be a nice, easy way to generate these write-ups for your homework or for labs or for the data analysis project that we're going to do later. Excellent. Thank you.